Guys, how's it going? So today, this is a bit of an odd tutorial, I think. I don't know. This tutorial is going to be about best practices for render settings when using not only true terrain. I know it is a true terrain tutorial, but I guess it works for any project that you're working on where you're going to be using adaptive subdivision. And you're going to be using micro displays, textures, and things like that. So hopefully it'll only be about 10 minutes. You won't have to sit through too much. I've sort of preset some stuff up so that you guys can get a better understanding of what's going on when it's going on. So we're going to jump straight in. So adaptive subdivision. What is adaptive subdivision? So it is a subdivision modifier, and I believe it was brought in 2.79a or b as an experimental feature. And essentially, if you apply a subdivision modifier, which we all know kind of adds more geometry, smooths some meshes, all that kind of thing. If like for example, if I change this to camel claw, see it's making a square round. Got this one set for simple for a moment, and I'll show you why. So we've got adaptive subdivision, which was a subdivision modifier, and then the guys over at Blender had the amazing idea to be able to provide people with high quality meshes that only need to be subdivided in the camera's view. And that's what adaptive subdivision does. It allows you to take a mesh in of kind of like a lower quality, and then use micro displacements to give that mesh detail. So, for example, let's look at the mesh that I've got set up at the minute. And it is just material from True Terrain, micro displaced. It's just one of the materials that we've got in here, and it has a adaptive subdivision modifier attached to it. What does that mean? Well, it means that the camera view that I'm now in is where geometry will be subdivided to provide micro displaced textures to add detail to the mesh. What I'm gonna quickly do is just go to change that to the same one and just scale that to 121, so that we can. There we go. So this is a tessellated plane using the adaptive subdivision. We're gonna just shade it smooth, and here are the settings that you need to adjust to use adaptive subdivision correctly. So the dicing rate is, it takes the information of your display or your rendered region or whatever it is, the amount of pixels that are in that area, and it uses those pixels in a, so we've got 8 pixels at the minute, which is an 8x8 square of pixels, little boom 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 square of pixels, and it will then tessellate geometry in that region, boom boom boom, up to the maximum amount of subdivisions that you set. So if I change this down to 1, and boom boom boom, it's only subdividing all of this by 1. And if I go into here and turn that off, you'll see that very little happened, but something did happen. The displacement did happen. If we change this up to 2, again, not much, let's double it, 4, we've got some tessellation that's now happening. 8, quite tessellated, but not exactly the most detailed. Put this up to 16. Not much changed. Now, why is that? That's because within this region, it can only subdivide up to a certain amount. So, or is it the other way around? So, if I change this to 4, this is for the preview view, we'll see that, again, not a massive amount changed. And if I change it to 2, it's taking a little bit longer, and not a huge amount changed again. That is because of the way the camera is located. So it could do a maximum of them amounts of subdivisions within that area, blah, 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 blah. If I tab in and out of edit mode and get real close to the mesh, see, we've now got a higher amount of subdivision that's happened within that region. And obviously, bear in mind, the texture's not ultra high resolution. So where's my camera? It's there. So this area here has been subdivided a lot more than the rest of the area. How do I know that? Because that's how adaptive subdivision works. So if we bring the camera out and we change this back down to 8 for now, and change this to 1 for now, we'll put it back up to 10 for now. And we will then use the off-screen scale, which will dice the plane that is not in the rendered view, less or more depending on the value. If we change this to 500, not much has happened. If we change it up to 2500, you can see that not much has happened. Why is that? Well, first of all, we need to reset the render. We can see it doesn't look like that much has happened. However, it has, and we can see it here. So where the camera cuts the view and everything behind it is not viewed, there is no tessellation there whatsoever. I'm telling you, there is none there. The reason it doesn't look like it is because there is not applied. So let's just drop the null on that for a minute. Drop the null on that for a minute. If we look at it, we'll see very little in the way of geometry that's been generated. But everything in front of the camera has been generated, and you can't see it very well here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap over to a little shader I created before, which uses the wireframe that gets generated. And here we go. We can see what the camera views is tessellated. And what the camera cannot view has less tessellation. This feature, this setting works in conjunction with camera's focal length, the amount of maximum subdivisions that you are allowing, and the off-screen scale. So if we put that on 50 and just reset the mesh, if I double tap and edit, and come back out, we will see that we now have a less jagged field of view subdivision. Is that the term? I don't know. Field of view subdivision. So that is a dicing of 50, or a scale of 50. Now, this does not use pixels. These use your pixels. This doesn't use pixels. This multiplies, I believe, the subdivision amount in steps of 50. So I'm not entirely sure, but it's something along those lines. So for every 1 pixel, then it would do a 50 pixel step, which is generated on the mesh and not on your viewport. And then for every step, it reduces the amount that gets subdivided. So for example, if we drop this down to like 6, go into the rendered view and double tap, or 8 even, and double tap, we can see that the amount we've rendered there is a lot less. If we put this up to something ridiculous like 16, now I am using the CPU for this and not the GPU, because Blender uses the RAM of your system on a CPU or the RAM of your GPU if you're using a GPU, like your video RAM. So this looks a bit weird. Kind of looks like a spotlight, but the closest point to the camera that is on screen is subdivided insanely high. I mean insanely high. Like, I don't even know if I can get down. I know I can't scroll down to the amount that that's subdivided. That's the maximum scroll I can get. And that is very, 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 very close. I mean, if we went into the field of view of the camera, it would just be completely white. As you get further and further away from the camera, the less subdivisions happen. And as we go out of the field of the camera's field of view, less subdivisions happen again. Now, if we change the off-screen scale to say something like 1500, and then go back on here, double tap the mesh, we get a very, very, very jagged amount of subdivision happening outside of the camera's view. Now, you're probably wondering, great, what's the problem with that? I mean, if it saves on RAM, it saves on resources, it saves render time. What's the issue with having the dicing, so high? Well, here's the issue. When you get to really high values, it causes some artifacting with the mesh. And what it can lead to is this bizarre splitting of the faces, so kind of like an edge split. So it's like the mesh has created all of these faces in subsections and then subdivided those subsections, but not subdivided the ones that it thinks it doesn't need to, because more than 50% of that subsection is off the screen. So we've got, like, here, for example, this is the square that we're looking at here. Only like 1/10 of that subdivided subsection is in the camera's view. So when Blender calculates the tessellation on the geometry, and it goes, okay, I'm going to split it into 50 main faces or 10 main faces, and then those main faces I'm going to subdivide 10 times. That's kind of what the off-screen scale is. It's where it goes, okay, let's split this mesh into 50 subdivisions or 50 faces, and then we're going to split them subdivided faces into regions of subdivision. Very complicated, very wordy, very jargony, but that's essentially what it's doing. So you'll have like an area like this, which is more than 50% of it is off the screen. So Blender thinks that it's an off-screen section, and you get, a really kind of crap thing going on here, which can cause some serious rendering artifacts. Another thing that happens with it is like kind of like the back. I don't really know. I'll give you an example because it's a wireframe shader, but like the back faces of subdivided areas are less subdivided than the front of them. That's just the nature of adaptive subdivision. That's not just something to do with this. Because it's off screen, Blender knows that it doesn't need to subdivide it as much. It still needs to subdivide it a certain amount so that the mesh topology flows into the next set of subdivisions, so that you don't have like a really high detailed front face and you can kind of see like 2 or 3 meters behind it, but just behind that highly detailed subface is just one square, because that would cause like weird artifacting, so it still needs to create a good enough topology for the back side of the rendered object to flow into the next visible part of that object. I believe the off-screen scale by default is like set to 2 or something, which is fine, I suppose. It'll give you a nice feathered bleed from on-screen to off-screen so that your geometry kind of flows off rather than cuts off. And when it does render, because we're up to 9 gigabytes of RAM at the moment, trying to subdivide up to 16 times on, you know, however many sections Blender's just created on this one single face. What have we got going on here? Come on, you should have updated by now. And I appreciate, like, this might not be the, you know, the most well thought out tutorial. Like, who the hell allows Blender to do stuff in real time on a tutorial in cycles? But I want to show you kind of like how the effect is and how it impacts you as an artist. So remember before when we had the actual line of field of view in, you know, subdivisions, and that was something set to 50. Well, now it's kind of like everything directly underneath the camera and around the camera is subdivided really high, and then there's like a exponential fall off, I suppose it would be. And if we change this to like 10 and double tap it, I don't even think we need to go back into the camera because it knows that it's dicing everything on the camera's view. So technically speaking, it should still work. So we can see it from like a third person perspective. You know, we can see the behind the scenes happening. Yeah, it worked. So, you know, that's how these functions work. Now, I don't want to take it too much of your time, but what I will say is you need to be careful when messing around with these values. Yeah, you can bunch this up to like 50 and have, you know, a lot less RAM that gets used, and you know, it's only 2.5 gigs now that it's using instead of 4, because we've took the off-screen dicing slightly at like a factor of 5. It's gone up by a factor of 5, so you know, we're not using 4 gigabytes of RAM for a single plane. We're only using 2.5. But when it comes down to sort of the logistics of it, you need to be quite careful. And the reason for that is because of how Cycles engine actually works. So we all know that Cycles is a ray trace engine, and we all know, or I assume that we all know, that basically what that means is that, you know, light is calculated as accurately as it kind of can be in the real world on your machine, and we know that light bounces around. So if we have like reflective surfaces, so for example, if I was to put a plane in here, a mesh plane, let's rotate it on the X by 90, bring it along the Y a little, no, the X a little bit, and bring it up on the Z, and let's just scale it along that value. And I did create a material before, metallic material, I did. And we just rotate our camera up enough. And we'll just bring this in a little bit more. So, I'm going to make it a different color so that we can actually sort of see it. There we go. So, you got a reflective surface like a car driving through an environment, or you're creating some architectural visualizations and you've got a really modern looking building, loads of concrete, loads of glass, looks amazing, and you stick an environment in and you stick some textures in for the ground and subdivided and displaced and micro displaced, and you've got all sorts of awesome things going on, and that's all kind of behind the camera, but you're looking at the building with the reflections. Well, here's what happens. So you've got off-screen value, let's set that to 250, and let's set the maximum subdivisions down to 12, and let's set the preview up to 2 pixels, and we're just going to double tap into this plane. Now, not much will happen to this plane, like in your rendered view, not much will happen. However, in the reflection, the quality has dropped tremendously. Now, it hasn't here because that's kind of in the view of the camera, so it knows that this area is in front of the camera and it will render it to a high quality, and the reflection picks up on that high quality until it gets further back from the camera, which is what we're seeing here. And that's how you end up with a beautiful reflection shot having like really low poly micro displacement going on in the reflections. So that's one thing to be careful of. Another thing to be careful of is when you actually render. So even though you're in preview, like you might be on a 1080p monitor. So like this rendered region is probably only like 720p, let's say, for example. So it's dicing the pixels based on what you've actually, got rendering. And the example of that is if we go to 1920 by 1080, and I change the render dicing to that, and off screen, leave it as it is, come out of rendered view. And this, again, I'm doing this in real time so that you can see what's happening. So this is what it would look like at 1080p. And we're using 2 gigabytes of RAM at 1080p. Now I'm not going to change any other settings other than the actual resolution that gets rendered. So we're going to bump that to 2560 by 1440. A nice quad HD, not ultra, but quad. And we render that off. And we'll just bring the screen down a little bit. Now, because Blender's working with more pixels, it'll dice the mesh closer. And the RAM hasn't gone up massively, but you'll see that the detail has increased. Now, if we these are as it is, subdivisions up to 14, drop that down to 50, and the dicing rate, leave it as 2, as an example. We'll see how much RAM that generates. And now bear in mind, this is still only a single plane. We've gone up to 3.5 gig, down from 2.6. And now we can see with the off-screen dicing that it's more gradual. The fall off is more gradual. So maybe if you're doing like a macro shot of something reflective, like I don't even know, let me think. I don't know, you're doing a nature shot and you're in like a garden and you created a really reflective ornament, and you were kind of close up, and all you were kind of looking at was like this bit, and all of this was kind of out of focus. You could get away with that. But if we leave these to like the default values as they were and render it at 2K Quad HD, whatever it is called these days. See that we're already up to 18 gigabytes of RAM. 18 gigabytes of RAM. Down to 14 because it's compressed everything now in its memory and it's just building the BVH. And then I'll probably get a notification to say something with the normal map. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? You see, this is already taking a huge amount more time. I mean, the last one was 53 seconds for render. We're already at 50. I reckon it'll be about a minute 10 before it actually kicks in rendering. And how much RAM have we used? 15 gigabytes. Yeah, we're up to 15 gigabytes of used memory. Back in the view page, triangles and strands, about a minute 19. And we're still not into render. Packing the nodes. We are at 24 gigabytes of RAM. 29 gigabytes of RAM. 34 gigabytes of RAM. It's a good job I've got 64 gigabytes of RAM. We're at... What are we at? Come on, where are we at? I mean, I think it's safe to say that this example that I've shown, it you know, exponentially multiplies your render times. Where in some cases, if you're clever enough with what you're doing, you won't lose that much detail. I mean, at this point, it's diced so much that you, with like a 4K or an 8K texture, you wouldn't even get the results out of that. You wouldn't even get. You need to be talking like 16K textures here to see this level of detail. I mean, it's basically all white. And the wireframe pixel is set to 0.001, and that's still that white. And you can see in the background, it's really highly tessellated, and there's no need for that in a real world scenario unless you work for someone like Weta Digital, in which case you probably wouldn't even know what Blender is. There's never any need for that kind of detail. And we have 35 gigabytes of RAM for that, and it was like 4 minutes just to get to the render. So I guess the point of this is kind of to tell you exactly how it works and show you in real time what happens and how it happens, what Blender does to create that information. What I'd say are best kind of practices is that when you are doing this kind of thing, let's just put another couple of these in for the argument. You've got 4 meshes, okay? And let's just say, for example, these are massive environments that you'd be able to see. A rule of thumb would be for anything in your scene that's not a focal point, you should go into the subdivision modifier and expressly change that 16 pixels. That's going to dice that, because that's so in the background, it's probably just going to be a shadow caster. This, which is kind of in front of the camera, we're going to want to put down to like 8 pixels, and this here we're going to have at like 6, and this we're going to leave at 1 for now. And then in the render settings, we're going to go to like 1920 by 1080p, and we're only really going to need 10 subdivisions, and we're going to go into the rendered viewport, and this is what happens. So your man over here, who we're not really going to see much of on our scenes, he's just a shadow caster, very little geometry is generated. Your man at the front, we've got quite a bit of geometry here now. And your man to the side, who might show up in some reflections, got a fair bit of geometry for them too. I mean, you can probably get away with putting them on like 12. And as you can see, what's just happened there is, if I increase the thickness of that for a second. So there we go. Got a lot of geometry here, which is kind of like just off view. If I was to delete this, it would just be here. Like, this is where it's captioned on the camera. And here again, this is kind of within the focal length, and this here, which is really within the focal length or in the view, is tessellated. And when you move the camera down, it'll tessellate based on how close you are, and the one behind it will drop off, and the one to the side of it will change, and that one will change, and we can change this to like 4. You can see the geometry fall off at the back. So if you're animating, you're gonna want to make sure like the Dyson scales are set on the individual item or the individual object subdivision modifier, so that you can get the most out of quality and also the most out of resource management. And as a rule of thumb, I'd always say like you really never need to go over 10 subdivisions unless you're doing something really, really detailed. For example, in True Terrain, the water object, if you increase like the detail of the waves and things, you're gonna need to put that to like 12 subdivisions, just to get that detail out. Whereas like objects with textures, so the water is procedural, completely procedural, just using Blender's internal texture nodes, math nodes and things like that. So that's infinite detail that's generated. Whereas like textures, if you're using 4K textures, 6K, 8K, you really don't need the subdivisions, because there's only so much detail that the geometry can be created where the displacement texture can affect it. So, if your 4K displacement's only going to be affecting like an 8 pixel by 8 pixel area, tiled, then you don't need that level of detail, because the texture would never be able to create it. You're just creating more resources, or you're using more resources than that are needed. So a rule of thumb I would always say is like if you're rendering at full HD, your dicing rate should always kind of be 1. Like your scene's dicing rate should be 1, and then you should manage individually the object's dicing rate based on the path that you're going to animate over. Like if you've got a camera flying over a couple of objects or something like that, or a really large object, then you should manage the dicing rate on that. The off-screen scale, again, that's really useful to manage the amount of geometry that's created out of the camera's view, but as a word of warning, just be careful, like I've shown you before, like reflective surfaces and things like that can show up these lower quality generating geometry, sorry. And another thing that I will say is that the camera's focal length also physically affects it. So if we were to set this to 80, I'm just going to change that again to 0.01 so you can see it. So if I set the focal length to 80, you can see it already tessellates more. And if I set the focal length to like 250, you can see it is overly tessellating, and there's no need for that level of tessellation. So just as a word of warning, when you're using your camera settings, you might need to increase the dicing rate to offset the amount of resources that are used. Another thing that I will say is that when you're rendering animations out, just be wary that because the dicing is based on the pixels, location, and the object's distance from the camera, you can get some what I would call LOD popping, so level of detail pop in and out. And it's kind of like if you ever played a game, like an open world game, and you're looking at like buildings in the background and they kind of look just like grey blobs, and then the closer you get to them, like textures pop on and geometry increases and things like that. Well, you do get that with this too, and an example of that, and I know I'm using Premiere Pro, I'm a terrible human being. An example of that is very prominent here. So just give this a second to load. I don't know if you've seen this, but this is the promo video or the demonstration video for True Terrain 3.0. I'll link that on the screen somewhere. So one of the final shots, I created a scene like in a tropical ocean, and we just created a kind of like a little green and sandy island. And the dicing rate for this was set to, oh geez, what was it? I think the scene dicing was set to 2 or 3, and this object was set to 1.5. Now, you will see this bizarre thing happening, which happens just here. So as the camera is actually closer to the geometry, it happens in kind of like a wave effect. You can see how much detail is created here through geometry. And as you move away, you can see the geometry reducing, and that can cause artifact. And now in motion at scale, you don't really notice it. It is there. I mean, I can see it, but you can get away with it. And you can see it happening over here and here. And in the background here. You can see it happening. So there is something to be wary of when you're rendering things out. You don't want the Dyson rate too high, because you'll lose the detail. Especially if you're animating. If you're just doing still renders, you know, set the figures to whatever you want. Obviously, just make sure that your focal point is the highest detail it can be. But background stuff, you know, you can set it to like 100 pixels Dyson if you need to. So that's it, guys. That's kind of it on, you know, resource management and how to manage tessellation and adaptive subdivision. You know, I know this was kind of like just a true terrain tutorial, but I don't want it to be just, you know, this is obviously for the people that bought true terrain to understand, you know, how to optimally use it. But anyone doing any scene for any animation or picture or render or whatever it is, you know, this tutorial is here to help you understand and manage how adaptive subdivision works. So that's all I'm going to say on that one. I know I went a little bit over, so 10 minutes, but that's that one, guys. Again, if you need any questions answering them, just drop me a message in the comments. I'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, like the video, and I'll be back with some more tutorials soon. Take care.